In this video, I am going to about the poem, A Far Cry from Africa. The poem, A Far Cry from Africa, was written by the renowned poet Derek Walcott. Walcott was a Saint Lucian poet and playwright who received numerous awards for his contributions to literature, including the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1992. The poem consists of 5 stanzas, each containing varying numbers of lines. The first stanza has 4 lines, the second stanza has 6 lines, the third stanza has 9 lines, the fourth stanza has 6 lines, and the final stanza has 6 lines. Stanza 1. The speaker describes a wind riffling the grasslands of Africa and compares the Kikuyu people to flies, referencing their involvement in the Mau Mau rebellion. The violence and bloodshed are hinted at with the mention of bloodstreams and corpses scattered in paradise. Stanza 2. The speaker portrays the indifference of the worm, symbolizing death and decay, to the dead bodies. They comment on how statistics and scholars justify colonial policies, distancing themselves from the human suffering. The speaker questions the value placed on human life and draws a parallel between the expendability of the savages and the Jews during the Holocaust. Stanza 3. The speaker shifts the focus to the natural world, describing the breaking of rushes by beaters and the dust rising from the wings of ibises. The violence in nature is seen as a natural law, but the upright man seeks divinity through inflicting pain. The wars of humans are compared to the dance of worried beasts to the sound of a tight drum. Stanza 4. The speaker reflects on the necessity of violence and the dirty causes it serves. They mention the Spanish Civil War and the struggle between the guerrilla, representing the oppressed, and the Superman, symbolizing the oppressor. The speaker, who is influenced by both African and English heritage, feels divided and questions how to navigate the conflicting loyalties. Stanza 5. The speaker expresses their frustration with the British rule and the dilemma of choosing between Africa and the English language. They grapple with the idea of betrayal and question how to remain indifferent to the slaughter in Africa and still continue living. The poem as a whole explores themes of violence, colonialism, identity, and the moral complexities of human existence. It raises questions about the nature of violence, the impact of colonial policies, and the struggle to reconcile conflicting loyalties. The speaker's personal anguish and disillusionment contribute to a sense of despair and the difficulty of finding a resolution in the face of the violence and oppression depicted in the poem. Now I'm going to discuss about the themes of the poem, A Far Cry from Africa. The poem, A Far Cry from Africa, explores several interconnected themes that reflect the complex historical and political context of colonialism and violence. Here are some of the key themes. 1. Colonialism and oppression. The poem grapples with the legacy of colonialism and the oppressive systems it perpetuated. It examines the violence, exploitation, and dehumanization inflicted upon colonized peoples. 2. Violence and conflict. The poem portrays the brutality and destructive nature of violence, particularly in the context of the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. It questions the moral implications and consequences of violence, both for those who inflict it and those who suffer from it. 3. Identity and cultural conflict. The poem explores the speaker's struggle with their dual identity, torn between their African heritage and the English language and culture they have come to love. It reflects the tensions and conflicts that arise from cultural assimilation and the loss of one's roots. 4. Humanity and inhumanity. The poem examines the capacity for both great humanity and inhumanity within individuals and societies. It raises questions about the blurred lines between civilization and savagery, and the dehumanizing effects of violence and oppression. 5. Moral ambiguity. The poem confronts the moral complexities and contradictions inherent in colonialism and resistance movements. It questions the righteousness of both sides, highlighting the difficulty of finding a clear moral stance in the midst of violence and injustice. 6. Loss and suffering. The poem evokes a sense of loss and suffering, emphasizing the tragic consequences of conflict and the human cost of violence. It portrays the vulnerability of the innocent and the anguish of those caught in the crossfire of political struggles. 7. Language and power. The poem touches upon the power dynamics embedded in language and the colonial legacy of the English language. It raises questions about the limitations and complexities of using language to address and express the realities of colonialism and oppression. 8. Disillusionment and despair. The poem conveys a sense of disillusionment and despair in the face of ongoing violence and the inability to find a resolution or reconciliation. It reflects the emotional and psychological toll of witnessing and experiencing the effects of colonization. These themes intertwine throughout the poem, reflecting the poet's exploration of the historical and political complexities of colonialism, violence, and identity. The poem invites readers to critically examine the consequences of power dynamics, the moral implications of violence, and the struggle to find a sense of self and belonging in the midst of conflict and oppression. Eight. Disillusionment and despair. The poem conveys a sense of disillusionment and despair in the face of ongoing violence and the inability to find a resolution or reconciliation. It reflects the emotional and psychological toll of witnessing and experiencing the effects of colonization. These themes intertwine throughout the poem, reflecting the poet's exploration of the historical and political complexities of colonialism, violence, and identity. The poem invites readers to critically examine the consequences of power dynamics, the moral implications of violence, and the struggle to find a sense of self and belonging in the midst of conflict and oppression.